They had already conquered 164 civilizations. Entire star systems had fallen without resistance. Fleets erased. Worlds silenced. Histories rewritten. To them, it wasn't war anymore. It was routine. So when they discovered Earth, they expected another easy victory. No warnings. No negotiations. Just another conquest to add to the list. But something went wrong. Because when their fleet entered the system, they didn't send back a distress signal. They didn't retreat. They didn't even leave wreckage. They simply disappeared. And for the first time in 164 victories, the galaxy started asking one question. What did they just awaken? They had never failed before. 164 civilizations. Catalogued. Classified. Conquered. Some resisted. Most didn't. It never changed the outcome. They arrived. They assessed. They erased. Clean. Efficient. Final. Entire star systems reduced to silence. Their histories cut short as if they had never existed. No monuments. No survivors. No second chances. So when Earth appeared on their maps, it wasn't special. Just another system. Another entry. Another inevitability. Scans came back. Normal. Oceans. Continents. Cities. Technology, developing, but not exceptional. Nothing that suggested resistance beyond the usual. Nothing that justified hesitation. Nothing that demanded caution. So they didn't hesitate. The fleet moved in. Standard formation. Standard procedure. Standard outcome expected. They crossed the edge of the system. And everything continued exactly as planned. For a moment. Then. Nothing. No explosion. No distress signals. No energy spike. No debris. No trace of battle. No trace of retreat. Just absence. 1 second. An entire invasion fleet. The next. Empty space. As if they had never been there. The galaxy noticed immediately. Because fleets didn't vanish. Not like that. Not completely. Even the most decisive defeats left something behind. Wreckage. Radiation. Echoes. Something. This. Left nothing. Observation networks replayed the data. Again. And again. Every sensor. Every angle. Every frequency. The result never changed. There was no moment of destruction. No transition into hyperspace. No measurable event at all. Just a clean cut. In reality itself. Where a fleet had been. And then wasn't. Panic didn't spread. Not yet. Because panic required understanding. And there was none. Speculation filled the void. Experimental weapons. Hidden defenses. Unknown allies. Ancient technology. Every theory. Every possibility. Tested against the data. None of them fit. Because every explanation required something to happen. And here. Nothing had. That was the problem. That was what made it wrong. Earth responded. Not with threats. Not with celebration. Not even with acknowledgement of what had just occurred. A single transmission. Broadcast calmly. Evenly. Across every major channel. You were advised not to enter. No anger. No triumph. Just confirmation. As if this outcome had always been expected. As if the warning had never been a bluff. Across the galaxy, attention shifted. Because now, this wasn't just a disappearance. It was a pattern. A boundary. A line that had been crossed. With consequences no one could explain. The question spread quickly. Not what happened, but something far more unsettling. What is Earth protecting? Or worse, what is it containing? Because fleets didn't vanish without cause. And whatever that cause was, it hadn't followed them out. It stayed. Silent. Waiting. Exactly where they had entered. And for the first time, in a galaxy that had watched 164 civilizations fall without resistance. Something had stopped the conquerors. Not with force. Not with war. But with something far more absolute. They had been removed. And no one knew if that was a defense. or a warning. They didn't call it conquest. They called it continuation. Because to them, it wasn't war. It was a process. Refined. Perfected. Unbroken. For centuries. 164 civilizations reduced to entries. Not stories. Not histories. Not cultures. Just outcomes. Each one recorded. Analyzed. Optimized. Because every conflict, every resistance, every attempt to stop them, was nothing more than data. And data made them better. They didn't celebrate victories. They logged them. Didn't fear losses. They learned from them. But the truth was, they hadn't needed to learn much lately, because nothing had challenged them. Not truly. Fleets that relied on numbers. Overwhelmed. Species that depended on strategy. Outmaneuvered. Civilizations that believed in technological superiority. Outclassed. Every advantage. Temporary. Every defense. Predictable. Every outcome. Inevitable. They adapted faster than their enemies could react. Changed tactics mid-battle. Reconfigured entire fleets between engagements. Turned weaknesses into traps. Before their opponents even realized they had one. To fight them was to be studied. And to be studied was to be defeated. Over time, resistance didn't just fail. It stopped forming. Because word spread. Not through fear, but through certainty. They could not be beaten. Not by strength. Not by intelligence. Not by unity. Because they improved with every encounter. While everyone else remained bound by limits. They became something more than an empire. They became a system. A flawless war machine. Self-correcting. Self-improving. Unstoppable. And when they looked outward, mapping the remaining civilizations of the galaxy, there were no unknowns left. Only future entries. Earth was one of them. At first glance. Unremarkable. A developing species. Fragmented history. Internal conflicts. Technological growth. But nothing exceptional compared to what they had already overcome. The analysis was quick. Efficient. Final. No anomalies detected. No elevated threat classification. No deviation from expected patterns. Entry 165. That was all it was. A number waiting to be assigned. A process waiting to be completed. They approached the system with confidence that had never failed them. Formation precise. Protocols ready. Adaptation models preloaded for every predictable form of resistance. Because they had seen it all before. Every variation. Every strategy. Every attempt to survive. And they had overcome every one. So there was no hesitation. No doubt. No reason to believe. This time would be any different. Because it never had been. Not once. Not in centuries. Not across 164 civilizations. Earth wasn't a question. It wasn't a risk. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a conclusion. They had already written. They just hadn't executed it yet. And that was the moment everything went wrong. Because for the first time, their system, their perfect, flawless, unstoppable system, was about to encounter something that didn't behave like data. Something that couldn't be predicted. Something that didn't follow patterns. Something that didn't need to win to make them lose. And they had no model for that. At first, they treated it like an error. Because errors happened. Signals dropped. Systems glitched. Data corrupted. Even fleets, rarely, could go silent for a moment. A moment. That was the key. This wasn't a moment. It didn't correct itself. Didn't stabilize. Didn't return. The silence held. Total. Unbroken. And that had no precedent. The empire didn't panic. It processed. Because that was what it did. Unknown variables weren't feared. They were analyzed. So they began with the simplest explanation. Interference. A localized phenomenon. Environmental disruption. Something in the system affecting communication. That could be mapped. Measured. Corrected. They deployed probes. Small. Fast. Disposable. each one equipped with redundant systems, layered communication arrays, independent recording cores. They entered the system, one by one, each transmitting continuously, position, status, environmental readings, everything. The first probe crossed the boundary, signal stable, telemetry clean. Then, mid-transmission, it stopped. Not distorted, not interrupted. Stopped. No final packet. No error code. No indication of failure. Just a clean break. The second probe lasted longer. Deeper insertion. More data. More time. Then, the same result. Silence. The third, fourth, fifth, all identical. Different paths. Different vectors. Different timings. Same outcome. The data always ended the same way. Not with an event, but with absence. Like a sentence. Cut off mid-word. The Empire adjusted. Long-range scans initiated. High-spectrum sweeps. Gravitational mapping. Energy signature analysis. They expected anomalies. Distortions. Something to indicate what had caused the loss. They found nothing. The system appeared normal. Stars stable. Planetary bodies intact. No unusual radiation. No detectable fields. No signs of battle. No debris. No wreckage. Not even residual energy from weapons discharge. It was as if nothing had happened at all. Except everything had. The absence became the anomaly. So they escalated. AI observers deployed. Autonomous systems. Independent cognition cores. Units designed to function beyond communication loss. If signals couldn't return, they would observe locally, record, adapt, find the answer. The first AI entered the system. Its internal logs transmitted continuously, until transmission ceased. Expected. But its onboard processes should have continued. It should have adapted. Should have analyzed. Should have found something. When recovery teams attempted to re-establish connection, they accessed its final internal state. Not damaged. Not corrupted. Incomplete. Its last recorded process. Ended mid-calculation. No conclusion. No error. Just halted. As if the system itself had decided that process would not continue. The Empire ran simulations. Billions of them. Every known form of interference. Every theoretical weapon. Every possible failure scenario. None matched. Because every model required causality. Something triggering something else. Here, there was no trigger. No chain. No visible cause at all. Only effect. And even that was uncertain. Because they couldn't confirm destruction. Couldn't confirm displacement. Couldn't confirm anything. The fleet was gone. But gone implied understanding. This wasn't understood. It was undefined. For the first time in centuries, their system stalled. Not physically, conceptually, because they had encountered something that could not be reduced to data. Something that didn't produce results. Only absence. And absence couldn't be analyzed. It couldn't be measured. It couldn't be predicted. It simply was. A silence that shouldn't exist. And yet, it did. Waiting. Exactly where their fleet had disappeared. Unchanged. Unexplained. And completely beyond them. At first, they thought it was absence. Now, they knew it wasn't. Absence was simple. Absence meant something had been removed. Erased. Gone. But this wasn't empty. It was wrong. The deeper scans began slowly, cautiously, because something in their system, something subtle, was already signaling risk. Long-range arrays extended, not probing directly, but skimming the edges, looking for inconsistencies. And they found them. Not in objects. Not in energy. In structure. Space around Earth's system didn't behave correctly. Distances fluctuated. Not visibly, but mathematically. Coordinates didn't align perfectly between scans. Vectors returned slightly different values, depending on how they were measured. At first, the deviations were small, negligible, dismissible, until they weren't. Because when layered together, they formed a pattern. Not random, not chaotic, deliberate, like reality itself. Had depth, multiple states, occupying the same space, and something was choosing which one you interacted with. Signals confirmed it. Transmission beams sent toward the system didn't behave consistently. Some passed through and returned, but altered, not corrupted, changed, data intact, structure intact, but meaning shifted, coordinates slightly off, timing subtly wrong, information that looked correct, until you compared it. Others never came back at all. Not blocked, not reflected, just gone, as if they had entered something that didn't return what it received, or worse, didn't allow return. The Empire increased resolution, focused everything on that boundary, and that's when they saw it. Not directly, never directly, but through distortion, like looking at something through layered glass, where each layer showed a slightly different version of reality. The system wasn't hidden. It was separated, stacked behind something, or inside something, or protected by something that didn't exist in a single state. And their scans, their probes, their observers, hadn't been destroyed. They had failed to align, entered the wrong layer, or the right one, but without permission to return. That realization hit harder than the disappearance. Because now, there was a possibility. Not that something had attacked them, but that something had filtered them. Allowed entry, denied exit, allowed observation, denied understanding, controlled interaction. At a level deeper than technology. For the first time, the Empire slowed. Not stopped, not retreated, but hesitated. And hesitation was something they had eliminated long ago. Because hesitation meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant risk. Their models began to break down. Because this wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't a defense grid. This wasn't even a weapon. It was an environment that operated on rules they didn't understand. And worse, rules that changed, depending on how you approached them. One analyst finally isolated the conclusion. Quietly, carefully, as if stating it too directly might trigger something. We're not being blocked. A pause. Then, we're being managed. No one argued, because every piece of data, every failed return, every altered signal, confirmed it. Earth's system wasn't protected by force. It was controlled by something far more precise. Something that decided what entered, what left, what was seen, what was lost. And for the first time, in centuries of flawless conquest, the Empire faced something they couldn't overwhelm. Because you couldn't defeat something, if you couldn't even fully reach it. And now, standing at the edge of that impossible boundary, they did something no one had ever seen them do before. They waited. The message didn't arrive with force. No surge, no override, no attempt to dominate the channel. It simply appeared. Clean, stable, perfectly integrated into every listening system the Empire had deployed. As if it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be noticed. You were warned. That was all. No identification. No origin trace. No accompanying data. Just 4 words. Spoken with a calm that felt deliberate. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Certain. The Empire did what it always did. It checked the records. Because records didn't lie. Records defined reality. Every transmission received. Catalogued. Every signal detected. Stored. Every anomaly. Flagged and analyzed. Centuries of perfect documentation. Nothing missed. Nothing lost. Nothing forgotten. So they searched. System-wide. Then deeper. Archived logs. Redundant backups. Distributed memory cores. even long-term cold storage, anything that could contain even the smallest trace of a warning from Earth. They found nothing. No signal. No fragment. No partial encoding. No unexplained interference that could have carried hidden data. Nothing. The conclusion should have been simple. No warning had been sent. But the problem was, the message didn't feel like a lie. It wasn't phrased as a threat, or a bluff, or an attempt to intimidate. It sounded like confirmation, like something already known, being acknowledged. That inconsistency triggered a deeper check, not of external data, of themselves, internal logs, cognitive archives, decision records. Every moment leading up to their approach of Earth's system, they began reconstructing timelines, cross-referencing choices, mapping intent against recorded input. And that's when they found it. A gap. Small. Almost invisible. A fraction of a cycle. Missing. Buried between routine analysis entries. Too precise to be random. Too clean to be corruption. A section of memory. Not damaged. Not overwritten. Removed. No trace of what had been there. No residual data. No error markers. Just absence. The Empire didn't panic, but something close to it began to form. Because memory was the one thing they trusted absolutely. It defined their continuity, their evolution, their perfection. And now, it had been altered. Without detection. Without resistance. Without permission. The implication was immediate. Either they had received a warning and ignored it, or worse, they had received it, and something had ensured they would never remember. Both possibilities were unacceptable, because both meant they were no longer fully in control of their own process. The message remained. You were warned. Simple. Final. Unchallengeable. Not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. That this, all of this, the lost fleet, the broken scans, the layered reality, wasn't unexpected, wasn't accidental, wasn't even reactive. It had been accounted for, prepared for, possibly triggered. For the first time in their recorded existence, the Empire faced something that didn't just resist them. It anticipated them, adjusted them, even edited them. And it had done so, without leaving a trace, except for one quiet sentence. A sentence that now carried more weight than any weapon they had ever faced. Because it didn't threaten destruction. It didn't promise retaliation. It simply stated a fact. They had been given a chance. And somehow, they had lost it. Before they even knew it existed. They didn't rush the second time. That alone unsettled the galaxy. Because this Empire, this flawless, relentless force, didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, didn't reconsider. And yet now, they did. The second fleet was different. Larger, heavier, more advanced. Not just built for conquest, but for uncertainty. Adaptive shielding, independent cognition nodes, redundant reality mapping systems. They weren't just preparing for resistance. They were preparing for the unknown. And this time, they didn't go alone. Observers gathered. At a distance. Far beyond the system's edge. Watching. Recording. Because whatever was happening near Earth was no longer a local anomaly. It was a question. The entire galaxy needed answered. The fleet approached slowly. Deliberately. Every movement measured. Every system monitored in real time. External feeds streamed continuously. Multiple civilizations. Multiple perspectives. All watching the same moment unfold. The lead ship reached the boundary. Paused. Ran final checks. Everything stable. Everything normal. Then it moved forward. For a brief moment. Nothing happened. The ship crossed the line. And remained visible. Signals intact. Structure stable. No disruption. No distortion. And across the observing networks, a quiet sense of validation spread. Maybe the first incident had been an anomaly. Maybe this time, they would get answers. Then the ship flickered. Not violently, not dramatically, subtly, like a visual glitch. A frame skipping in reality itself. Its outline shifted. Edges misaligned for a fraction of a second. Then corrected. Sensors flagged it immediately. Minor distortion. Unclassified. The ship continued forward. Another flicker. Longer this time. Not just visual. Telemetry lagged. Coordinates returned conflicting values. The ship was, for a moment, in two positions at once. Then it stabilized again. But something had changed. Observers leaned in. Because now, they could see it. Not clearly, but unmistakably. The space around the ship wasn't consistent. Layers. Shifting. Overlapping. Like reality itself. Couldn't decide what the ship was interacting with. The second ship entered. Then a third. Each one repeating the pattern. Crossing the boundary. Remaining intact. Then beginning to desync. Flickers became distortions. Distortions became fragmentation. Not physical. Not structural. Positional. Existential. Ships appeared slightly out of phase. Offsets in time. Offsets in space. Like they were slipping between different versions of where they should be. The fleet slowed. Then stopped. For the first time. Mid-operation. Because now, the truth was becoming visible. This wasn't destruction. Nothing was being attacked. Nothing was being damaged. The ships were still there. But not entirely. In the same place. Or the same state. One vessel tried to reverse. Engines fired. Commands executed. But its movement didn't match its intent. Part of it moved. Part of it didn't. For a fraction of a second. It existed in two trajectories. Then, it flickered again. And was gone. Not explosively. Not suddenly. But in stages. Sections of its structure. Phasing out of alignment. Until there was nothing left to see. Observers held their breath. Because this time, they saw it happen. Not a disappearance. A process. One by one. The ships followed. Each entering. Each destabilizing. Each losing coherence with the space around them. Until they simply ceased to exist in any observable form. No debris. No energy release. No aftermath. Just absence. Arriving gradually. The final ship lingered longest. Holding position at the edge. Flickering between states. Almost stable. Almost aligned. As if it were, for a moment, on the verge of understanding how to exist there. Then, it flickered once more. And vanished. Silence followed. Not confusion this time. Not speculation. Understanding. Because now, they had seen it. The ships weren't being destroyed. They were failing to remain. Entering a space. Where existence itself was conditional. Where being there required alignment. With rules they did not understand. And when that alignment failed, they didn't explode. They didn't break. They simply stopped existing in a way the universe could recognize. Across the observing civilizations, a single realization spread. Earth wasn't defending itself. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't even resisting. It was enforcing something far more fundamental. A boundary, not of space, but of reality. And anything that crossed it, without permission, didn't die. It just failed to exist. The data didn't come from one place. That would have been easier, cleaner, dismissible. Instead, it surfaced everywhere. Fragments, buried in archives no one had opened in centuries. Encoded in dead languages. Stored in formats so old, most systems didn't even recognize them as data anymore. At first, it looked like noise. Corrupted history. Myths. Stories that had survived longer than they should have. But as more civilizations began searching, really searching, patterns emerged. Separate records. From species that had never met, never shared knowledge, never overlapped in territory, all telling variations of the same thing. A war. Not recent. Not even within recorded galactic history. Older. So old. Most civilizations had built their entire existence after it ended. A conflict not between empires, but between reality and something that didn't belong to it. Descriptions varied, because no one had truly understood what they were seeing. Some called it a presence, others a fracture, others still a hunger. But every account agreed on one detail. It couldn't be destroyed. Weapons had no effect. Energy passed through it. All was absorbed without consequence. Matter failed to interact with it in any meaningful way. It didn't behave like an enemy. It behaved like a flaw, something that shouldn't exist, but did anyway. And worse, it spread. Not rapidly, not aggressively, but inevitably. Systems exposed to it began to change. Physical laws destabilizing. Signals losing coherence. Objects failing to remain consistent. Reality itself becoming unreliable. Civilizations didn't fight it. They tried to escape it. And they failed. Because escape required distance. And distance stopped meaning anything near it. That was when the war began. Not a war to win. A war to delay. To contain. To hold the line. Against something that didn't recognize lines at all. Ancient alliances formed. Not out of politics. But necessity. Species that would have destroyed each other stood together. Because the alternative was extinction without understanding. They tried everything. Weapons. Barriers. Dimensional isolation. Temporal displacement. Nothing worked. Not permanently. The entity, or phenomenon, or whatever it was, adapted. Not intelligently, but fundamentally. It didn't respond. It simply continued. And then, in the middle of a war they were losing, something changed. A new variable. A young species. Insignificant. Primitive. Barely capable of interstellar communication. Humanity. At first, they weren't part of the war. They were too small. Too new. Too irrelevant. But proximity changed that. Because they were close. Closer than anyone realized. Closer than anyone should have allowed. Ancient records describe confusion. Concern. Then something unexpected. The phenomenon. The thing that couldn't be stopped. Reacted. Not violently. Not aggressively. But differently. For the first time. It didn't just continue. It adjusted. Localized. Stabilized. Around one point. Around one system. Earth. At first. No one understood why. Theories flooded in. Genetic anomalies. Environmental factors. Random coincidence. But the effect was undeniable. Where humanity existed, the spread slowed. Not stopped, but contained. Held. As if something about them, their biology, their cognition, their very existence, interacted with the phenomenon in a way nothing else could. The war changed. Not into victory, but into strategy. Because now, there was a possibility, not to destroy the threat, but to trap it, to anchor it, to build a containment. Around the only place it behaved differently. Earth became the center. Not by choice, not by power, but by necessity. Ancient civilizations poured everything into it. Technology, knowledge, sacrifice, layer upon layer, of systems designed not to fight, but to hold, to stabilize reality itself, within a defined boundary, to ensure the phenomenon remained contained, and at the core of it all was humanity, not as rulers, not as warriors, but as the anchor, the constant, the one variable that made containment possible. The war ended, not with victory, but with silence. The phenomenon stopped spreading. The boundary held. And one by one, the civilizations that had fought it disappeared. Not destroyed. Not defeated. Gone. Their purpose fulfilled. Their knowledge left behind. Fragmented. Forgotten. Buried. Until now. Because as the empire approached Earth, as fleets vanished, as reality itself refused to behave, those ancient fragments began to resurface, aligning, completing, telling the truth. No one had remembered. Earth wasn't just a world. It wasn't just a species. It wasn't even just a civilization. It was a containment point, a lock, a boundary, holding something that couldn't be destroyed. And humanity, whether they fully understood it or not, was the key. The warning, the missing memory, the disappearing fleets. None of it was an act of war. It was maintenance. Because the last time the galaxy ignored this truth, it nearly stopped existing. And this time, the system protecting it was still active, still watching, still deciding what was allowed to cross the line and what wasn't. The message didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like a correction, as if something the galaxy had misunderstood for ages was finally being stated properly. Earth responded again. Not louder, not harsher, just clearer. You are misinterpreting the event. No anger, no urgency, just precision. A shift from warning to explanation. Because now, it was necessary. Earth is not a target. A pause, long enough for every listening system, every observing civilization, to process the implication. Then, Earth is an anchor. That word spread instantly, not because it was complex, but because it simplified everything. Anchor, something that holds, something that stabilizes, something that prevents movement, not by force, but by presence. And suddenly, all the anomalies, all the distortions, all the disappearances, started to make sense. Not as attacks, not as defenses, but as consequences. The transmission continued. What is contained here cannot be destroyed. That line hit harder than anything before it, because it confirmed the ancient fragments. The forgotten war, the thing that couldn't be fought, only held. Containment requires stability. Stability requires alignment. Alignment is enforced. Each line built on the last, like a system being explained, not to intimidate, but to clarify rules. Rules that had always been there. Rules the Empire had violated. Without understanding they existed. Then came the truth. The part that changed everything. Your fleets were not destroyed. Across the galaxy, every observer focused. Because this was the answer they had been searching for. They were displaced. Not gone. Not erased. Moved. But not through space. Not in any way that could be tracked. Or reversed. Depth was introduced. The phrase made no sense. Until it did. Reality wasn't flat. Not here. Not around Earth. It had layers. States. And the fleets. Had fallen through. Not violently. Not deliberately. But inevitably. Because they weren't aligned. With the layer they had entered. They crossed a threshold without compatibility. Another pause. Then, they triggered containment. That was the moment. Everything locked into place. This wasn't a defense system reacting. This wasn't a weapon activating. This was a mechanism, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Something entered. That didn't belong. And the system responded. Automatically. Precisely. Without emotion. Without hesitation. They are not within your accessible state. Not destroyed. Not reachable. Not here. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere the rules were different. Somewhere they could not return from. Silence followed. Not forced this time. Not controlled. Chosen. Because there was nothing left to argue. Nothing left to challenge. Because the Empire hadn't been attacked. They hadn't been resisted. They hadn't even been targeted. They had simply stepped into something they were never meant to touch. And the system, the ancient, layered, reality-bound system, had done the rest. One final line appeared. Not as a warning. Not as a threat. But as a statement of fact. Do not attempt reentry. No emphasis. No escalation. Because none was needed. The evidence was already undeniable. Across the galaxy, understanding spread. Earth wasn't a fortress. It wasn't a superweapon. It wasn't even a strategic position. It was something far more fundamental. A lock, holding something beneath reality itself. And humanity wasn't guarding it. They were part of it. Part of the mechanism that kept it closed. The fleets hadn't been destroyed. They hadn't been defeated. They hadn't even been engaged. They had fallen into something deeper, because they crossed a line that wasn't meant to be crossed. And now, for the first time, the galaxy understood the truth. Earth was never just a homeworld. It was a boundary, and everything beyond that boundary wasn't meant to come back. It started as a fluctuation. Small, measurable, but not alarming. At least, not at first. Sensors across the edge of Earth's system, those brave or foolish enough to keep watching, picked it up simultaneously. A deviation. Not in energy. Not in matter. In consistency. The boundary. That layered, controlled, impossible structure. Wavered. Not broken. Not failing. But strained. The cause became obvious quickly. Too many entries. Too many disturbances. Each ship that crossed, each probe, each attempt to force understanding, hadn't just vanished. They had added pressure, stress, on something that was never meant to be tested repeatedly. Inside the system, something shifted. For the first time, the containment didn't just hold. It reacted. Across the solar boundary, cracks appeared. Not visible to the eye, but unmistakable in the data. Layer separation instability, reality divergence spikes, regions where the rules, briefly, stopped agreeing with each other. And then, humanity moved. Not like before. Not silent. Not passive. This time, it was immediate. Decisive. Every hidden fleet. Every submerged platform. Every structure buried beneath Earth's surface. Activated. Across oceans. Across orbit. Across points that had never appeared on any scan. Human vessels emerged. Not in attack formation. In alignment. Precise. Purposeful. Each one taking position. Not against an enemy, but along the boundary itself. Reinforcing it. Stabilizing it. Holding it together. Because this wasn't a war. This was maintenance under pressure. And the pressure was increasing. The cracks widened. Not physically. Conceptually. Sections of space. Briefly revealing something beneath. Not clearly. Not fully. But enough. Enough for the galaxy to see. For just a moment. What had been sealed away. It wasn't a shape. Not something that could be outlined. Not something that could be described. Because it didn't exist. In a single form. It was vast. Not in size. But in presence. Like a pressure. Pushing against reality from the other side. Observers felt it. Even across impossible distances. A distortion in perception. A sense that something was aware. Not of them individually. But of the boundary. Of the containment. Of the fact that something outside was interfering. For a single moment. The cracks aligned. And something pressed back. Not violently. Not aggressively. Just present. Enough to make stars seem dimmer. Enough to make signals stutter. Enough to make entire civilizations, watching from safety, feel something they couldn't process. Not fear. Something deeper. Something older. Something that didn't belong. In a universe that made sense. And then, it was gone. Not because it left. Because the boundary closed. Snapped back into alignment. Harder. Stronger. Reinforced. Human fleets held position. Locking every unstable layer back into place. Stabilizing. Correcting. Ensuring that what had almost happened would not happen again. Slowly, the distortions faded. The cracks sealed. Consistency returned. Reality normalized. But the moment, that single, impossible glimpse, remained, burned into every recording, every sensor log, every mind that had witnessed it. Because now, there was no doubt. This wasn't a theory. This wasn't ancient myth. This wasn't misinterpreted data. Something was there. Something vast. Something contained. And for a brief moment, because of repeated intrusion, it had almost woken up. Humanity's final transmission came shortly after. Not loud, not angry, but carrying a weight the entire galaxy now understood. Further interference will not be tolerated. A pause. Then, for your sake, not ours. And this time, no one questioned it, because they had seen what almost came through, and they finally understood why it had to stay sealed. When it was over, it didn't feel like victory. There were no celebrations, no broadcasts of triumph, no declarations of dominance, because nothing had been won. Something had been prevented, and the cost was written into space itself. The boundary held, stronger than before, reinforced by everything humanity had, but not without consequence. Regions around Earth's system, once empty, navigable space, were now gone, not destroyed, not collapsed, inaccessible, coordinates that no longer resolved, routes that no longer existed, entire sectors, cut out of reality's usable map, not erased, but sealed, permanently, as if the act of stabilizing the containment had required tightening it further, pulling the layers closer, locking them into a configuration that could never safely be opened again. Ships that tried to approach, even cautiously, found nothing to approach. Navigation systems failed to define direction. Distances refused to calculate. Space itself no longer behaved like space. And so, they stopped trying. Because now, everyone understood the risk. Human fleets remained for a time. Not in formation. Not in defense. But in watch. Silent. Present. Ensuring the boundary. The seal remained stable. Then, as quietly as they had come, they withdrew. One by one, slipping out of observable space, not vanishing, but stepping back, leaving behind only the system, the boundary, and the memory of what had almost happened. Across the galaxy, no one spoke of conquest anymore, not the way they used to, because the definition had changed. Victory was no longer about what you could take, or destroy, or dominate. It was about what you could survive. And more importantly, what you could prevent. The final transmission came after the silence had settled. Not immediate. Not reactive. Deliberate. Broadcast across every known channel. Every language. Every system capable of receiving it. Humanity's voice. Calm as ever, but carrying something new. Wait. You counted victories. A pause. Long enough for every civilization. Every empire, every observer, to understand who that was meant for. We counted survivals. Not a correction, a contrast, a difference in perspective, that now felt impossible to ignore, because one led to expansion, the other, to existence. Another pause. Then, the final line. Next time, don't come this close to ending everything. No threat, no anger. Just truth. The kind that didn't need emphasis. Because it had already been proven. No one responded. Not because they couldn't. But because there was nothing to say. The empire that had never lost. Hadn't been defeated. It had been stopped. Not by force. Not by war. But by something far more final. Understanding. Because now, they knew. Earth wasn't a prize. It wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't even a civilization, in the way they had defined one. It was a line, and crossing it didn't lead to victory. It led to something far worse. A reminder that some things in the universe aren't meant to be conquered, only contained, and that the greatest power wasn't the ability to win. It was the ability to keep everything from ending.